of university staff and students from all 8 universities across Aotearoa. We are committed to better practices and policies for dealing with sexual violence on campus. My name is Kaylee and I'm the administrator of SSHOC. I'm also a master's student at the University of Otago. You can find more information about us on our website and our Twitter, and I'll put both of those in the chat. Just a bit of housekeeping. Eva and John's talk will be recorded and later posted online, but the Q&A bit afterwards won't be. Just a content warning for discussions of sexual violence, and I'm going to link some support services into the chat. Please keep any questions to the end or feel free to message me throughout and I can relay them during the Q&A section. It's a pleasure to welcome Eva Tutchell and John Edmonds, authors of Unsafe Spaces, published by Emerald Publishing last year. You can find a link to a free chapter download in the chat and a link to a 30% off discount for the book. Eva and John, thank you so much for being here today and being willing to talk to us about your book. I'll pass on to you. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, many thanks for inviting us to speak to you today. My name's Eva Tutchell and my background in education, first as a secondary teacher for many years and then as a local authority advisor on gender issues. John and I write about women's rights and this is our 3rd book together. John?
It's great fun using one screen for 2 people, as you can see. I'm John Edmonds. For most of my life, I've been a trade union official. And during the time when I was representing people at work, in both the public and the private sectors, I saw so much discrimination that I made up my mind that at the end of my trade union career, I would concentrate on writing about equal rights and gender equality.
Thank you. What we're going to do is to speak to you for 15 minutes each, and then I think, Kaylee, you'll be opening it to questions. In the course of researching our previous book, The Stalled Revolution, we visited a London university, and during our conversation with a member of the teaching staff, we were told that sexual harassment and abuse was rife on the campus and that both students and academic staff were victims. And that made us decide that a book was urgently needed on this subject. As John will explain later, no official national survey has been conducted in the UK to establish the number of sexual assaults in British universities. So we relied on authoritative surveys undertaken by the National Union of Students here and other organisations, including 2 national newspapers. Our best estimate is that at least 50,000 students are sexually abused here every year. And this is a conservative figure. The real figure could be significantly higher. I'll begin by reading from the first page of chapter 2, which we call Stories of Distress. Accurate figures are necessary if we're to develop an effective policy to eliminate sexual abuse, but numbers are only a small part of the story. What affected us most as we interviewed the victim survivors was not how many there were, but how much damage was done to their confidence and to their lives. Here are some of their comments. Their words were heartfelt. I will never fully recover from this. I feel like it is destroying me. It made me distrustful of male friends for a long time afterwards. It was all a living nightmare. So what are we talking about here? Sexual harassment and abuse that ranges from comments, inappropriate touching, groping, unwanted sex, through to actual rape. We were told about incidents covering during the course of our interviews. So let's begin with the comments. Joking remarks aimed mainly at women about their physical appearance, commonly described and dismissed as banter. A strong reaction from women results in them being told they've no sense of humour. Can't you take a joke? And the trouble is, as Tiffany Page puts it, laughter disables. It's hard to respond to being respond to accusations of being profane without a bit of harmless fun. Let's progress to groping. This is the kind of thing we were told. It's impossible to go on a night out here without being groped. I would expect to be sexually harassed every time I went to one of these clubs. On the arse as a man goes past and then quickly disappears. And according to another NUS report, groping, flashing, and unwanted sexual comments have become almost every day for some women students. Is this really acceptable? One of the most unpleasant stories we read in a Universities UK report of 2016 was regularly taking place in Durham University until someone was brave enough to confess to her experiences. I'll read from the report. Spying a pretty girl across a packed nightclub, a young man, usually wealthy, by the way, because their parents could afford the fees if anyone took them to court, in expensive jeans, smiles and begins to dance ever closer to this girl. Winking first at his gaggle of grinning chums over her shoulder, he leans in and whispers, "You are hideous," before clamping his arms tightly round her, cuddling her for as long as possible before she struggles to force him off. If that happened to me, I'm not sure how long it would take me, if ever, to forget it. We were also told of a girl lying in the street and being peed on, friends of the boy standing round laughing and egging him on. What on earth's going on here? Young men intelligent enough to go to university behaving like hooligans. I'm sure you will all recognise what we were told over and over again. It's groups of men acting as a pack after a sports event, usually rugby, fueled by cheap alcohol, losing all inhibitions and assaulting. Lads by night, decent guys by day, as one report puts it. Well, perhaps, but that doesn't account for T-shirts worn at any time, day or night, with slogans such as, "It's okay to rape on your birthday." It seems clear to us that this is misogyny. Alison Phipps of Sussex University describes this as lad culture, which at its simplest is about young men who feel that their masculinity is under threat, or at the very least, feel the need to prove their masculinity. Here are some of her examples. Rugby teams wearing T-shirts saying "raper." A member of a feminist society locked in a coach toilet and pelted with porn magazines. A woman pushed down the stairs in a bus, confronting a group of students, exposing their penises. Fuck a fresher race. In a Unilad magazine, they wrote 85% of rape cases go unreported. These are good odds. And for me, one of the nastiest, seal clubbing, a repulsive term describing attacks on women freshers. Gay men, by the way, are despised and ridiculed by this group. And I want to add another reason for the problem, easy availability of pornography. This explains the actions we described. Boys as young as 11 are able to access it on their phones, and it gives a totally distorted view of sexual relationships. Kat Banyard, and I recommend her book, Pimp State, has written about her many interviews with women involved, and men actually, in pornography. This is how she describes pornography. Pornography denotes a trade in which real live women, not imaginary women, not fantasy women, are paid to have sex at prescribed times with prescribed people for prescribed durations in prescribed ways. Sorry. Adding to the distress is the fact that the vast majority of sexual assaults are committed by men known to the victims, often in the same friendship group. Probably the same thing happens where you are. This is one reason that victims don't report assaults, but another reason will be familiar. Did I send out the wrong signals? As embarrassment, a desire to wipe it from memory, fear of not being believed, not wanting to disappoint parents and not knowing whom to turn to. Well, so far I've concentrated on sexual misbehaviour among students, We were shocked to discover the prevalence of staff-student relationship. The differential power relationship clearly makes this an unequal partnership. Anne, not her real name, described the lecturer who pursued and succeeded in seducing her. He was good-looking, charismatic, charming, and persuasive, very appealing to young women, and he needed the constant admiration of younger women too. Well, it must be flattering for a young woman living away from home, seeking social acceptance and finding her way in a new environment, to have the attentions of a respected academic. But when the affair ends, she is left abandoned with her self-esteem in tatters and occasionally ostracized by her peers, who've probably dragged her name in the mud through social media. For many women who've been mistreated in this way, the anguish stays with them for years, and some of the people who talk to us have not talked about what they experienced for many years. Some of the brave women who came to us recounting incidents that had taken place years before. They're deterred from reporting as well because it could affect their grades. PhD students are even more vulnerable if they only have one supervisor, and junior staff could put their future career prospects in jeopardy if they file a complaint against a senior staff member, especially if he is well known in academic circles and therefore financially invaluable to their university. He brings in money, so he's inviolate, we were told of one known campus predator. For women of colour, the problem's exacerbated. As a young woman whose family had settled in the UK from the West Indies told us, I don't want to be seen as the angry black woman. And these predators are known. Sometimes students are simply advised to avoid them. They're even given nicknames. We were told of Dirty Dick, Handy Andy, and Lester the Molester. This situation is surely intolerable in a decent society. We were told more than once that institutes of higher education are not divorced from the rest of society, and that abuse happens outside will inevitably take place on campuses too. And of course this is true, so the problems will broadly be called cultural, because this is the world we live in. As a senior university staff member told us, the power play at university play in society. Funding has become a major issue in British universities. I don't know whether that's true for you. So as one university governor said, although we read and hear reports on a wide range of subjects, sexual misconduct and abuse is not given any airtime. Another senior staff member told us, sadly, the concept of university as a community of scholars has disappeared and students have become an economic resource. Well, what we're talking about here is being called the marketization of universities, where everything is judged on its economic values. Even the outrageous utilitarian idea promulgated by one former Minister for Education, that a student's academic success should be determined by their future earnings. The demise of subjects like philosophy, sociology, history, languages, and the arts forfeits areas of the curriculum where reflection and debate is encouraged on issues affecting how we conduct our lives. Also, to make matters worse, for many academics now, there's little or no security of tenure and 0 hours contract for some PhD students who are teaching with teaching responsibilities. We're looking at a form of corporatism where it is least welcome or desirable. In such a debilitating, stressful and unstable environment, student and staff welfare are bound to be a casualty, with few, if any, trained and specialist staff to deal with the fallout. In these circumstances, it's easy to see why sexual misconduct slips down the agenda, a setting which is largely hidden from scrutiny because universities are to a large extent closed communities. One final thing. A worrying aspect that was mentioned to us in a couple of well-known universities was the concept of such institutions being known as liberal, where freedom of expression is paramount and criticism of misbehaviour is considered an infringement of sacrosanct liberty. And this all sounds very depressing, but we are keen to make clear when we talk about all our writing that we do feel optimistic about the human need and ability to work for positive change. We wouldn't be speaking to you if this weren't the case, and you wouldn't have invited us. In some unsafe spaces, we give due consideration to how this might come about some of our solutions a bit later.
Well, thank you very much, and over to me. The history of sexual abuse in British universities is actually quite long and is mostly very unedifying. Every university used to have its own notorious predator. There's a favourite story in Oxford University of a college principal storming across the city to demand that Edvard Frankl, a classical scholar of some repute, should keep his dirty hands off her students. Well, following the prosecution of Weinstein, the launch of Me Too, and in Britain, the imprisonment of nearly half a dozen high-profile entertainers and others, there's been a lot that sexual abuse should be taken more seriously, and universities have had to respond to this change in public mood. Under a certain amount of government pressure, they set up an inquiry, and the report, to the surprise of many, was strongly worded. It declared that the high level of sexual abuse was unacceptable, and universities were urged to adopt a policy of zero tolerance. Well, that was in 2016. 2 years later, we started interviewing people throughout the university community, and we hope to see clear signs of improvement. I'm afraid we were disappointed. Indeed, we found an atmosphere of resignation and some despair. One student leader told us, in all honesty, they, that's the university authorities, don't want to know. And a professor admitted, universities do everything possible to distance themselves from this issue. Meanwhile, and rather more difficult to shrug off, a whole series of national media reports were scandals throughout higher education. We've summarized 20 reports in our book, but I'll just mention 2 cases which illustrate the neglectful attitude of certain universities. In Warwick University, a group of male students set up what was called a sex chat network, where they named students whom they said should be raped. Quite open and quite explicit. When the network was uncovered, the university began an investigation which was led, of all people, by the director of communication university, who was obviously conflicted. He had no training in investigation methods and apparently no experience in handling sexual abuse allegations. Well, an outcry followed in the university, and eventually some of the perpetrators were suspended and some were expelled. But when an appeal was heard, unknown to the victims, many of these suspensions and expulsions were reversed. And the victims realized several months later that most of the sex chat gang, as they called them, would soon be back on campus. Not before time, Warwick decided that some of its procedures needed reform. At Sussex University, a lecturer was arrested for beating up the postgraduate student whom he lived with. The university didn't suspend the accused until 9 months later, and that was only because there was in the university itself and constant pressure from both national and local media. An inquiry was conducted and the report was caustic about the behaviour of the university. The last paragraph was ominous. It said, Does this happen only in one university? Absolutely not. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Well, to understand more about this miserable scandal, the whole gamut of sexual abuse in universities, we sent requests under Freedom of Information Law to the 102 universities in England and Wales, asking for their policies and the procedures they used when dealing with complaints of sexual abuse. Eventually, and it was eventually, there were a lot of reminders necessary, all who replied, they sent us or referenced, now think about this figure, 738 documents which they used. 738. That's an average of 7, more than 7 actually, for each university. These documents were long, at least 10 pages on average, written in complex legalese, which would strain the patience of the most experienced lawyer. And the tone was cold. That was the most noticeable feature. No comfort to the victims, just an airy detachment. We studied all 738 documents. No one told us this research was going to be easy, and it wasn't. But while it was arduous for us, so much worse for the victim of sexual abuse, who has to get her head round a bundle of complex documents when she needed simplicity, comfort, and support. In Britain, we have a commissioner appointed to ensure that victims in court are treated properly. We went to see her and we asked her what makes a good procedure in cases like this. And she explained to us the concept of procedural justice, At every stage, the victim should receive sympathy and support. Well, we look for those qualities in university procedures. They're almost never mentioned, the needs and well-being of the victim. To reduce stress, the stress of the victim, that is, the process should reach a quick verdict. We found few time limits in university procedures. Some cases take over a year and others are never completed. One academic told us, the authorities just wait for the student to graduate. When she leaves, the complaint leaves with her. The victim should be kept fully informed throughout the process. Well, that is rarely guaranteed. The victim often has to ask what's going on. Some victims, scandalously, are never told the outcome of the investigation and the adjudication. Many rules in these procedures are obscure. Victims are usually required to go through an informal procedure before they can make a formal complaint. Victims told us that they often thought that their complaint was being investigated, but when they asked what was going on, they were told nothing was taking place because they hadn't got to the formal complaint stage in the procedure. Worse still, and this is quite awful, victims of sexual abuse often have to use procedures which cover all types of complaints. So they often encounter rules which are quite inappropriate. Some procedures actually suggest that the complainant should approach the person they accuse in an attempt to reach what is called an accommodation. This might be reasonable in a complaint about a noisy party, but to tell a victim of sexual assault to go to see the perpetrator is scandalous and frightening. And the next example is incredible, but it is absolutely true. One university's procedure goes even further and suggests that if the complainant finds it difficult to talk to the person they can accuse, they might consider taking assertiveness training. Extraordinary. In our book, we make an overall evaluation of these sexual abuse procedures. Our conclusion is dispiriting. Over a quarter of universities in England and Wales have processes that are badly out of date. Nearly 2/3 have procedures which need major reform, and only 9 universities have procedures which meet modern expectations of procedural justice. I repeat, only 9 out of 102 universities in England and Wales have procedures to deal with sexual abuse which are fit for purpose. Well, so the big question which we tackled in the last 3 chapters of our book is, how can universities do better? All in all, we identify 25 reforms which universities should implement, and we list them all in our book. However, we have enough experience to know that if you drop 25 instructions onto the desk of most managers and say they all ought to be implemented, their eyes will roll and nothing much happens. So we focus on 5 priority changes. The first is very basic. Universities are meant to be evidence-based organizations. But on this issue, universities do not have the data to construct a credible policy. Before we go any further, we ought to explain, as Eva has mentioned, that there's been no national survey of the extent and nature of sexual abuse in British universities. So they don't know how many incidents of sexual abuse actually take place. They rely on the number which are reported by students and staff. However, because sexual abuse is always massively underreported, that information is incomplete and misleading. As Eva said, our best estimate is that 50,000 students are seriously abused each year, but it might be double that. It's scandalous that there are no authoritative figures. The dearth of reliable data is woeful. Students and staff are most vulnerable. There's almost no data on students from different heritages or about the vulnerability of LGBTQ+ students. And there is no reliable data whatsoever about the abuse of staff. So our first urgent and priority recommendation is to call for an independent and anonymous survey of the whole British university community to collect data so that policies can be based on evidence rather than on guesswork. Our second recommendation is intended to end the detachment, what I call the lofty detachment, of senior management. University principals should be required to meet victims so that they see the distress firsthand, as we did, and understand the need in all humanity to give the elimination of abuse a much higher priority. And if that means that universities employ more specialists to design policy, train managers, and support victims, so much the better. Our third priority recognizes that complaints of sexual abuse require special attention and should be handled differently from other issues. So universities should create a separate and distinct procedure for reporting and handling complaints of sexual abuse, with substantial support for victims and a commitment to produce a decision on each case within 1 month. Quite possible, rarely achieved. Sustainable policies to eliminate abuse require, as Eva said, a culture change in higher education. So our fourth priority is to launch a program in each university led by the principal to show the commitment to that end, designed to transform the often sexist and misogynistic sexual culture on many campuses. Lastly, we were surprised that only 6 out of 102 universities ban teaching staff with their students. This is in spite of the massive imbalance of power, the opportunities for academic staff to be exploitative, the damage to the lives of the student concerned in these affairs, the disruption to courses, the claims of favoritism, and much worse. So we urge all universities to ban sexual relationships between teachers and their students. That's an important symbolic change but it has enormous practical benefits. So our conclusion is that this is something like a modern tragedy. Almost everyone we interviewed, principals, managers, academics, students and staff, say they want universities to be places of safety. And yet, on our very conservative estimate, something like 50,000 students a year and an unknown number of staff suffer sexual abuse. Our book demonstrates that what universities in England and Wales are doing at present is not working. We advocate a fresh start. We want universities to study our proposals and, at the very least, implement our 5 priority policies. They would, without doubt, make universities into happier and much safer places. Thanks very much, Kay. Thanks, everyone.